Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last days. What a privilege to be here with you. I just want to let you know that we are going to be talking about Nova Scotia today, and then I am going to be in Nova Scotia, and that is coming up very shortly, like in about 10 days or so. And so I'm pretty excited about that, but I'm pretty alarmed at sort of some of the things that we've been hearing about Nova Scotia. All of you remember the 22 murders. We've had Paul Palango on several times before to talk about what happened there. And now a stunning new revelation. Something took place last night that was, or maybe it was the day before yesterday, because I got the news yesterday, but it's put another sort of interesting twist into it all. Just to let you know, we were in Saskatoon last night. Mark Friesen and I did our big event. It was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for showing up. And the next event we're going to be at is Barrie, Ontario. We go on to Owen Sound and we make our way around southern Ontario. Then we're in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. So go to my website to find all of that. That's the next one up. And at the end of the show, we'll tell you where all we're going to be. And we hope that you all come out. Let me tell you, people are loving getting together and having an opportunity to be of like mind, to stand up for our country and to stand up for justice. And we do really feel that something's gone a bit wrong in our nation with the justice systems of Canada. Have any of you noticed that? I actually gave some information out the other night at a talk that I was doing. Now, that was in Prince Albert, and I let them know that I was not suicidal because the information is so kind of stunning that you just want to make sure everyone knows, hey, in case somebody takes me out for talking, because y'all know I have a very big mouth, and that is why I don't like Bill C-11 at all. In any case, I'm going to ask our guest to come on. Mr. Adam Rodgers is going to join us today for the very first time, and also Paul Palango, who we've had on the show before. And I'm very honored because both of these gentlemen understand the Nova Scotia shooting. They understand it intricately and intimately. They have studied all of the facts surrounding all of this. And so we had quite a development last night. Mr. Palango, could you tell us what has happened in Nova Scotia in the last day or so?
Well, we were doing our regular Sunday night podcast, the nighttime podcast with Jordan Bonaparte. And Jordan and I thought it would be a good idea to have Adam on because he had just written and published a book, Deficits of Trust, about the Mass Casualty Commission investigating the 22 murders that took place in April 2020. And about halfway through, 3/4 of the way through the show, my phone rang. I'd forgotten to turn it off. And my landline rang. And my wife answered it. And I could see who had called. I could see who the number was. And I wondered what it was about. And just as Adam was talking about his book, I saw an email come in from someone else and telling me that Leon Jodrey had committed suicide. And then it turned out the first call was the same thing from another ex-law enforcement officer who I'm aware I know. And they were telling me, so it put us in a bit of a dramatic conundrum. Like, what do you do? Do you announce this? Do you know if his, when did it happen? Was his family informed? And the point of the whole thing was that I decided to say that this happened. I have not confirmed it, but I believe it to be true because my sources were reliable sources who were familiar with the situation. And Leon Jodrey was an important person in the Portapique massacres because he was the neighbor who lived on Portapique Crescent. And at 6:30 at 3 in the morning, 3:34 in the morning, he smelled smoke and drove around the neighborhood and saw very little RCMP presence. In fact, the one Mountie he ran into didn't even search him or whatever. Well, they're still searching for the gunman who killed 13 people in that neighborhood. They didn't even search him. They just told him to go away and go back to his house or report to a Mountie Mountie cars at the entrance to subdivision. And then at 6:30, the shooter, Gabriel Wortman's girlfriend, common law wife, Lisa Banfield, showed up at Leon Jodrey's door, and Leon was stunned. They had a bit of a discussion. Leon was worried about her being there because Gabriel Wortman, the shooter, didn't like him, but she offered to leave. That she comes in. He called the RCMP, 911. They came and got him and never searched his house, never did anything, and just scooted off with her. And from that moment, almost immediately, he told 911 operator and then police later that he didn't buy her story that she'd been in the woods all night because of the way she was dressed. She had no shoes, no socks, no gloves. She was wearing yoga pants and a spandex top. And he stuck to his story. But unfortunately, the police didn't want to hear it. The media didn't want to hear it. The Mass Casualty Commission didn't want to hear it. And he was suffering. This guy went from being a robust, talkative guy, and over the last 2 years got low, just started to fade, put on weight, had some psychiatric issues. And, I think it's very easy to see that he had sort of what do they call it? Survivor's guilt. As he said to me a number of times, 13 of my neighbors died. My best friends were murdered. And why didn't I get killed? Because you got to remember, at Portapique, just about everyone got killed. A couple of kids survived, didn't get shot. Andrew McDonald didn't get killed. He got wounded. And Leon Jodrey, who was one of the few witnesses to what was going on that night, never got over it. I think that's a fair assessment right there.
Right. And Adam Rodgers, so is it true maybe that some people have never really believed the story of this gentleman that appears to have taken his life?
Well, I think people believed his story, but because it was credible and he had no reason to make it up. He was telling it live as it took place. And so I think he had a very credible account. But one of the major failings of the Mass Casualty Commission that was examining what took place, the police response, all that took place around the shootings, was that they really marginalized the community, the people that lived there, the family members of those that died. An inquiry really should have started off by hearing from those victims, family members, people like Leon Jodrey, but he never got a chance. And now I was involved in the Lionel Desmond inquiry, and in that inquiry, the family members, people that knew Corporal Desmond, had a chance to get on the stand, say what had happened to them, how they felt, and it was a way to process that trauma in a way that was really meaningful. Being on the stand in an official capacity, it has a meaning that just talking to a friend or somebody else doesn't. But Leon Jodrey never got that chance. Other participants never got the chance. And this is one of the consequences.
I mean, Laura-Lynn, like one of the things I pointed out in my book and previous to that in articles I wrote in Frank magazine when it was alive, was that Leon was interviewed by the media, mainstream media and the alternative media, numerous times. And he told the same story over and over again, how he didn't believe Lisa Banfield's story, which was counter to the narrative that the police and the government were prepared to put out. And it got to the point where he was interviewed by Global TV for one of their documentaries on the subject, and they left out everything he said about Lisa Banfield and left in just she came to the door and that was it, but none of his opinions of what he saw. And he was an expert woodsman. He lived in the woods. He worked for the Department of Natural Resources. He knew the woods. He says there's no way she was in the woods. She wasn't dirty. She didn't have, there was too cold, et cetera, et cetera. And Global TV, for example, as I point out in the book, what they did at the time was when they were confronted with the fact that Leon's story was not used in their documentary, they said, well, his story, the editor at the time said, his story conflicted with the official police version of events. So we went with the official police version of events, even though it didn't make sense. It was like illogical. They would not even address it in any way. And I thought that really got him down, that to be treated that way.
Absolutely. So, Adam Rodgers, why did the police story conflict?
Well, the police and then the Mass Casualty Commission itself very early on decided that Miss Banfield's account was credible. They were going to support that the main theme and sort of causal element of all of this was a domestic violence situation between Gabriel Wortman and Miss Banfield. And anything that seemed to conflict with that was pushed to the margins, ignored, or actively suppressed. Like with Leon Jodrey. I mean, this testimony, it conflicted with the police. I mean, she was supposedly in the woods all night and all these things. And like Paul just said, her physical condition at that time didn't really match up. And you would think an inquiry that was wanting to get to the bottom of things would have delved into those discrepancies and, tried to examine them and get to the bottom of it. Instead, they went with their sort of preset narrative and just moved on from Mr. Jodrey.
We've had occasion to talk to Paul Palango quite a bit on this. And Paul, you've outlined many different discrepancies. And it's an honor. I understand that the two of you have both independently researched this entire topic. And I really appreciate that you're actually having been willing to be on together. That's just fantastic. Mr. Rodgers, have you come to the same conclusions as Paul Palango that a lot of things don't add up? There was was it just one police officer that was killed, a female police officer?
Yeah, there was one police officer, Heidi Stevenson, who was killed. There was another, Chad Morrison, who was wounded. But I come to a lot of the same conclusions. And the book is really an attempt to back up my recommendation, which is that the RCMP be removed from Nova Scotia as the police force and replaced with a provincial force, as they're looking to do in British Columbia and Alberta. And I called it deficits of trust because there was really three. There was the police didn't trust the people, and that's why they didn't give emergency warnings while things were taking place. And so lives were lost as a result. They didn't trust the people. They thought people would become vigilantes and start shooting at officers, which, studies show wouldn't have been the case. Then the people lost trust in the police because they kept, they wouldn't give information. They were, not disclosing documents to the commission, all of those things. But then the commission itself took on a lot of the same characteristics as the police, and people lost trust in the commission. So I felt somewhat of a responsibility to put these things on the public record, show what really took place, identify some of the faults in the commission so that future public inquiries could learn from it.
Well, and Paul, some of the determinations that you've come to is it just doesn't all add up very well. Like something is very wrong and might lead to actual corruption in the police force or whatever was going on there. We had the odd things like the money from Brinks. And do both of you sort of align on all of the details of this story?
Well, we mostly align. We have a few little minor disagreements, probably, but they're only minor disagreements. I think that, Adam, being a lawyer, sees it in a very sort of lawyerish way. And in his book, what I really like is the way he's taken apart various aspects of the investigation by the Mass Casualty Commission and shown what they did and how they basically confused issues for the public and made basically what made things that should have been exciting and newsworthy dull and boring and caused the media and the public to switch off and not pay attention to what was going on. One of the things that I've highlighted, here's something, Laura-Lynn, that the commission stopped its hearings, its public hearings. When was that, Adam? What, a month ago?
A month ago, yeah.
A month ago. And then last Thursday, they dumped 2,000 new documents. on the public, 2001 day. And in those documents, so the media is basically overwhelmed. They're not, all this stuff has been pre-digested by the MCC, and the public is supposed to, okay, 2,000 documents come and go, 3 or 4 days, it's all gone. And both Adam and I are probably not going to let that happen. I mean, one of the documents that they released was with regard to something we talked about long ago, like in one of our first meetings, about Assistant Commissioner Leona Lee Bergerman, who was in charge of the RCMP in Nova Scotia at the time. And Bergerman, who comes from a family of Mounties, her sister's a Mountie, her brothers are Mounties, I think her father was a Mountie, her uncles are Mounties. She rose to the top. And, we might remember from the first press conference that was held on April 19th, 2020, she was abysmal. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights. She basically disappeared from from public view. And then in the summer, we didn't know it at the time, but her husband and the husband of one of her officers under her, Janice Gray, who ran the RCMP in Halifax, their husbands were hired to be go-betweens between them and the Mass Casualty Commission. They're both Mounties. One's a Mountie, one was an ex-Mountie. During this same period, the RCMP began destroying documents. And we talked about this about a year ago, that I got copies of a memorandum of the moratorium on the destruction of documents, which was dated October 15th, 2020, while her husband, Bergerman's husband, was in charge of the documents, and Janice Gray's husband was in charge of the documents. We wrote about this. We found out about it in June or so, 2021, and wrote about it in Frank magazine. And the documents from the other day showed that the RCMP immediately conducted an investigation from Ottawa, Staff Sergeant Kerry Patrician, and he recommended right away that Bergerman be fired and that her husband be fired. What happened? Nothing. The MCC never revealed this document. In the fall of 2021, the Justice Minister for Nova Scotia, Brad Johns, brought Bergerman's name up in the House of Assembly to praise her for the work she had done. Although she hadn't testified at the MCC. She finally testified at the MCC on August 15th, August 22nd, I should say, a few months ago. But the MCC didn't interview her till August 5th, as Adam points out in his book, until she had reviewed everything everyone had said, and then she was never questioned about her husband, the destruction of evidence, what evidence was done, the fact that the RCMP wanted to fire her but allowed her to resign and retire. And all these documents come out well after she has gone in a dump of 2,000 other documents. Absolutely outrageous, corrupt. And Adam, you could add to it if you wish. I mean,
well,
yes.
you don't need a moratorium on something that isn't happening. So they were clearly destroying evidence, destroying documents, deleting files. And so, the moratorium demand or instruction was meaningful just to know that was happening. And so that's part of the problem with the RCMP. And the other is all this, that was just an egregious conflict of interest. And they just did it and assumed nobody was going to care, I guess, when they brought in these husbands to these important positions. One of the big issues with the RCMP in Nova Scotia is that there's no real oversight. And I'm sure this is what people in Alberta and British Columbia are looking at too, is like, well, no, but they don't answer to anybody in Nova Scotia. They answer to Ottawa. They answer to the national leadership of the RCMP, and nothing, no political masters, no civilian oversight really in Nova Scotia seem to be looking at the RCMP in any meaningful way. So, that's not really how policing should be in a province.
It's all very disturbing, and leads us to believe that something else is going on, and that's not very pretty for Canada.
Well, one of the things that's not pretty for Canada, because what we're getting here from government, at all levels, municipal, provincial, and at the federal level, is this basically knee-jerk, thin patriotism, where, the thin blue line patriotism. This is the RCMP. They're the National Police Force of Canada. They must be protected, in spite of the fact there's been 30 years of warning signs flashing bright red. There are problems with this force that can't be fixed, that the force is unsustainable in its present form. And adding to what Adam said, that this force has contracts as a contract police force of the provinces outside of Ontario and Quebec that are crazy. I mean, there is no oversight on this force. There are no, in the Nova Scotia agreement, for example, there's no mechanism for the province to exert any control over the force. They can't even know about Bergerman, for example, being threatened with being fired, because they're not told that. She's the chief police officer in the province, and nobody can do anything about it, good, bad, or otherwise. Same thing's going on in Alberta and British Columbia, where they're looking at this. But the RCMP will, and its followers will, they're like a cult. They'll protest, cry, whine, whatever, to make sure nothing changes with the RCMP. And that's entirely wrong. That's not patriotic. Patriotism is dealing with the issue and making things stronger and making things right.
Yeah, it's it's such a difficult thing to make big changes like this take place, because like Paul said, the RCMP has such a strong image in Canada. One of the many experts that the Mass Casualty Commission brought in was a British professor, talking about how change in the British police was so difficult because, they had reached a revered status like the RCMP. It's a symbol of Canada, so it's a difficult thing to change. Plus, you need to have public momentum and public opinion behind it. And the Mass Casualty Commission, like Paul was saying earlier, seemed to be actively trying to limit the size of its audience. And they had to know, because they had, a dozen or 15 public relations staff, that having a smaller audience, making things less dramatic, less interesting, was going to limit that audience and then limit the opportunity for momentum to gather for change, which is so difficult anyway, but they made it much more difficult just by the choices of procedure. And they must have been deliberate choices. I can't imagine otherwise.
Wow. So are you both from Nova Scotia then?
Well, we both live here. Adam, you're forever from Nova Scotia.
I'm from here, yeah, born and raised.
Because we've got a lot of people from Nova Scotia actually on the line and making comments, and this has really rattled the whole community. It's rattled the feeling of safety and trust in the justice system.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, and there's reasons for that. The RCMP model for policing is basically, I see one of your commenters said that, oh, well, it was a rural area and, it's the RCMP no police force could get there on time. That's wrong, because the RCMP model for policing is basically virtually unchanged from 1874 when they started out. It's, one man on a horse or in a car, or one woman on a horse or a car, going here, there, and everywhere, under policing, under supervision, all the problems, under resourcing, that, many of the things that happened during the massacre revealed they had poor communications, poor radios. Heidi Stevenson was killed. She was 48 years old or whatever, had been a Mountie all her life, but she'd been on the musical ride for 13 and a half years. She wasn't carbine trained. She wasn't basically a combat officer. She was a public relations, school relations, musical ride rider. And then she ended up in a situation with a guy who had already killed 19 people by the time he got to her. And she was alone. She shouldn't have been alone. But the RCMP defended her as being, she was heroic. And look what she did. She shouldn't have been where she was. And the better model for policing is what you're seeing now in Ontario and Quebec, with large regional police forces that work together. They're trained the same. The RCMP has different training than other police forces. The RCMP says, we're better trained. Objectively, they're not. The best trained police forces are municipal police forces in Canada now, the Ontario Provincial Police, the Sûreté de Quebec. The RCMP lags way behind them and is getting farther and farther, falling farther and farther behind. We need a new model for policing, and it has to be brought down to the grassroots level, where the provinces and the municipalities who are responsible for policing have full control about it. Because the other problem is that the RCMP gets hired on the cheap. They come in, they have a federal sort of view of problems. So when they go in to become your municipal or provincial police, they're there to bring in the federal agenda into policing and ignore the local problems. One of the examples that was pointed out to me recently was there's an RCMP detachment where everyone's getting training in Aboriginal policing, but there's no Aboriginals in that area. But it's a federal prerogative that they have to do that. And that's not the issue in that community. But that's an example of how it works. There's nothing that the provincial justice minister can do about it. They have no say over what the RCMP does. And these are where the problems come from. It's political foolishness, as the person pointed out. It's the easy road. It's political imperatives. And then the final problem is the commissioner of the RCMP, as we've seen, is politicized. That, beginning in 1984, the RCMP commissioner was made a deputy minister in the federal government and is appointed by and serves at the pleasure of the prime minister, like some of the better banana republics. This is not the way policing should work in a democracy.
And Mr. Rodgers, one of the questions is regarding that 400,000. Was it directly 400,000 or over that amount? Has that ever been solved? What went on there?
Oh, with the cash that Wortman took out from Brinks. So there were some emails that showed that he had made this request to CIBC, his bank, that he wanted to withdraw this money in cash. And so that seemed to answer some questions. But what it didn't answer was, how did he have $475,000 in cash as a denturist? And this is something that the Mass Casualty Commission was... I wouldn't say reluctant. They refused to get into it. There was no discussion of his criminal past, of, he had a history of cross-border smuggling, some evidence that he was involved in drug dealing at a scale, some really compelling circumstantial evidence that he was involved perhaps as a police agent or informant. And none of these things were explored to any depth whatsoever at the Mass Casualty Commission. And, part of what they were supposed to do was figure out what happened. And they really refused to go down any dark alleys or anywhere where they weren't comfortable with what had taken place or something wasn't clear. They just didn't dig in like they really should have.
Well, one of the things that Adam points out in his book from that I thought was really, really on point was how the public inquiry into this should have been designed to get to the truth, but they took a completely different approach. That and I'll let you explain it, Adam, because you did it last night.
Yeah. So one of the things I thought, because there was 3 commissioners appointed. There was Michael McDonald, who was the former Chief Justice of Nova Scotia, who sat on the Court of Appeal here, who was retired as a judge. There was Leanne Fitch, who was a former Chief of Police in Fredericton and a police consultant. And then there was Kim Stanton, Dr. Kim Stanton, who's a lawyer based in Toronto, had been the lawyer for Leaf and had written a book on inquiries. And hers was more of an international perspective, looking at the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls inquiry and comparing that internationally to things like, the South African post-apartheid inquiries. And in those cases, the facts, the situation had already been established. And what the inquiry was designed to do was repair relationships, bring people back together. And so it was a restorative inquiry. Well, it seemed like the Mass Casualty Commission was taking that approach, but without doing the first part of where they go get the facts, establish what really happened, and then with those facts in hand, go about repairing whatever relationships need to be repaired. Instead, they jumped to a conclusion about what took place and just went from there. But it didn't work, because unless people agree on what's taken place, then how can you effectively repair relationships? And by the way, the police didn't seem all that inclined to try to repair the relationships. There were very few apologies, very little, almost no contrition out of any of them, certainly in an official capacity. So, it was, I think, a real failing of the inquiry. Just as their entire approach seemed to be the wrong kind of inquiry.
And then this brings us back to Leon Jodrey. The focus of the inquiry is to be trauma informed, and from that, you took that they meant they didn't want to traumatize the families of the dead and the victims, but what they did they stayed away from almost anything that was controversial, but they also boxed out the families, and then they boxed out people like Leon Jodrey, who should have been testified, should have been given his day to tell his story. And they ended up traumatizing him to the point where we saw what the terrible thing that happened. I mean, it's on them in my mind, because they're the one group that could have dealt with this guy. He was very troubled at the end. I've been dealing with him for over 2 years, and I watched his slide. And, my associate who helps me, Chad, was going to call him the other day and missed the call and was just devastated that this happened yesterday. But, the commission said it set out not to traumatize anyone. They've traumatized virtually all the families and the public and many of the people who are party to this thing. It's horrible.
I did have someone from Nova Scotia who really, gave me a call, and he tells me about all things Nova Scotia. And he basically said, is there any chance that he would have been murdered for any reason? Can you see that there was anything that would be threatening to this investigation, a piece of the puzzle he would know? Or do you really, it seems that you believe that he has actually taken his life, but people always question, because there's so many different things.
Well, the people I've talked to about what happened late last night, I mean, what happened in the last days, Leon was complaining he had no work, no money. He wanted to move out of Portapique. He couldn't afford it. He was running out of food. The police had taken away his guns. He couldn't even go hunt and get himself a deer. In the end, it appears that from the information I have, that he had a generator in the house, that he had it in his bedroom. The door was closed. His two beloved dogs, Iserman and Basil, were in the other part of the house. And around just after noon yesterday, a neighbor, there aren't many neighbors there, but somebody heard the dogs barking and barking and barking. And they went to investigate, and they found the scene. So the police arrived around 12:20 yesterday afternoon, and then they were at the scene most of the day. I don't think in that situation that there was anything nefarious directly that happened. I think that he was just worn down and just lost his way. I mean, it's horrible. I wish I could have done more. At one point he wanted to come and live at our house about a year and a half ago. And he, instead of doing that, we had a bunch of cats, and his dogs were kind of wild. And if I'd known at the end he was that bad, I would have had him come here, live here, like Leon, come live here. But he,
right. We don't know.
Yeah. But he went, at one point last winter, he bought himself a shed, basically a prefab small shed house, moved it into the woods at Moose River, and was going to camp out in the woods, and he almost froze to death. Then he had to go live at a friend's house and live on the couch, and eventually he moved back into his house in Portapique, and that's where he died.
Yeah. And Adam, would you say the same thing, that you don't see any reason to believe anything other than that it's a very sad end to his life?
Yeah, I think what Paul, I mean, I wouldn't have any first or second hand information. It's just from what I'm hearing, and everything adds up. And my involvement in the Desmond inquiry, we had some experts that came in to speak about suicide. And unfortunately, Leon Jodrey, just by being a single man of his age, was in a high risk group. And there's too many men and young guys, that are in that situation and don't see a way out. But but some of the expertise that we heard during the Mass Casualty Commission was from experts out of Norway, where they had that terrible shooting, and then out of after 9/11 in New York. And some of the lessons there seem to be that this heartache, it just lasts a long time, and there's no easy solution. Even counseling, all this stuff is good for people, but what they really need at a sort of foundational level is to know that something has come of the tragedy, that there's been some, change made, something meaningful, and so they can have some consolation and move forward with that. In this case, we're at a point now, 2.5 years on, and I don't know if people have the confidence that kind of change is really going to take place, whether the Mass Casualty Commission is going to recommend it or whether governments would implement it if they did.
Well, in hindsight of all of it, have any of the police officers been so courageous as to say anything outside of the official narrative?
Very little. What has happened? I mean, you have to understand, Laura-Lynn, that what has happened here, like if you look at Commissioner Brenda Lucki, the way her political interference allegations were handled, where she called and asked about guns and all that stuff, and then they said, well, the audio tape was lost, and then she testifies at the Mass Casualty Commission, like Bergerman testified, and none of the bad stuff about Bergerman was brought in there, only released after she had testified, so she wasn't questioned about it. Same thing with Lucki. She said, oh, there was no political interference and the audio tape was lost. Then the audio tape is found last week or so, and you find out, yes, there was political interference. That's what she was doing. She was acting on behalf of the government. But one of the things she said and highlighted was, Lucki said, oh, there were serious communications problems in Nova Scotia right from the beginning. I couldn't get communication. They weren't talking to each other properly. They weren't doing this. They weren't doing that. What happened under Lucki's command? The person in charge of communications, Inspector Dustine Rodier, got promoted. Chris Leather, the chief superintendent, who was the crops officer, got promoted. Superintendent Darian Campbell got promoted. All the key people in this thing were promoted before the Mass Casualty Commission even met. So it tells you that the RCMP, including Lucki, had come to the conclusion well beforehand that nothing bad had happened. They'd done their best, and everything was swept under the carpet, and they thought it would stay under the carpet, and it hasn't gone that way. Stuff is coming out, and I think at the end of the day, we're going to get some heroic officer who's going to come forward and tell us what really happened. Because the thing about policing is most people in policing are honest people who feel they're there to serve the public. And this hurts them a lot to be in this position, and they want to get the truth out. Many of the others are there for the pension and the perks. I'd hate to say it, and the promotions and whatever. That's their loyalty.
Our whole world has shown that people really bow, to the authorities and whoever's doing their paycheck, and maybe they get paid off. We've got all kinds of things that we don't know about, and it happens in all of our, all the places of authority in our country. We've seen it happen. Well, we'd like to let everybody know where they can each get both of your books. And if you have anything more to add, I certainly would welcome you to do that. This is a very sad development, and Nova Scotia has kind of a mar on it because of this. And unless there is something that's fixed, I don't know if you want to comment to this, Adam.
First, Adam. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there needs to be some change. When I think of, you're asked the question about, well, were there any, expressions of contrition or anything like that? One of the things the mass casualty really did in misinterpreting their trauma-informed mandate was protect senior police officers who weren't really on scene, didn't see any violence or violent scenes directly, but were in commanding positions in testified by video, or they weren't cross-examined, all these protections. Now, a couple of those staff sergeants were Rodgers and Addie McCollum, and both expressed, that they regretted missing things. They look back and like, well, I could have done this different, which is a very natural thing for people to do after something goes wrong. If you're a pitcher and you give up a home run, you're not thinking you threw a great pitch.
Having a little bit of problems.
Oh, sorry, you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah, now
so
you're there.
In those two cases, the gentleman did express some regrets. Adam McCollum, when they were at the Fisher's home, Paul, you would know all this, wished he had charged on instead of staging at a distance. Bruce Briers saw the Heidi Stevenson request for a public alert to go out. Well, he didn't see it at the time. He saw it after the fact and was very upset that he didn't see it at the time and has to live with that now. And that all came out during their testimony. And it just reinforced to me again how important it is for people to get on the stand and have their say and process that trauma in that manner.
Right. Do you both feel that what added to all of this was that he was never given like the just respect maybe for the key sort of information he had?
Absolutely. I mean, he said, why don't they believe me? Why do they keep ignoring what I say? Getting back to the RCMP, I mean, one of the things we have to understand in this country is that this force is unsustainable. There are not enough people going into the force. Its model is wrong for policing in Canada. It's contract policing is an old way of doing policing. It's unaccountable. It doesn't work. It's expensive. It's dangerous. But you're getting, you see, look what's happening in Surrey, where Surrey set up its own police force and they took the RCMP out of there. And the RCMP is fighting tooth and nail to maintain that detachment. And one of the problems is that in Surrey, they made the mistake of hiring ex-Mounties to run the force. They have a different philosophy of policing than municipal police forces everywhere. You have a large contingent of people in society who are related to Mounties, who buy into the Mounties story, who have fond memories of the musical ride. They want to keep the Mounties, but they're not looking at it rationally or objectively about what the problems are with this police force. And hopefully Alberta, which seems to be moving in that direction, will do something conclusive and sort of we've got to move them for the betterment of the country and the betterment of the force. Make the RCMP a federal police force, and that's it. They're not.
Do you think the police are a little disconcerted by this latest development, that it might look bad on them?
I don't even know if they care anymore. There's so much that looks bad on them. It's just water off a duck's back. I mean, they look at it like, oh, there they are, people complaining about us again. Do you know how dangerous it is for us to go out there and do our jobs? Well, policing is not the most dangerous job in the world. Far from it. I mean, you want to have a dangerous job, be a fisherman. Work in construction. Drive a tractor trailer. Be a taxi driver. Those are much more dangerous jobs. Yes, they have dangerous jobs, but they're well protected, they're well paid, and they get great benefits, and they're there to serve the public. That's their job. They're there, they sign up for that job. And one of the things that happened here, that's the same thing that happened in Uvalde, Texas, you had policemen show up who were afraid to get hurt. That's not serving the public.
Yeah. And then commanders, Paul, who wouldn't send them into a situation, even when some of the constables and corporals wanted to be more aggressive, then the command structure was, holding them back from getting involved. So, I think people in Alberta and British Columbia that are making these decisions now are thinking about what the RCMP role in their province might be. Can look to this Nova Scotia situation, because I think there's going to be a domino effect. If the takes the courageous decision to create a Nova Scotia police force and replace the RCMP, then I think that's going to set an example for other provinces to do the same.
And that's it. I agree 100%.
Wow. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. And so would you each tell us how anybody could follow you or get your books? We'll start with you, Mr. Palango. Where can we get your book? People, I think this is going to go down. Also, I'd like to know if any of you would follow the Honey and Barry Sherman murders, since you're into investigation, if that's ever come across your mind to dig into that.
Kevin Donovan's done a lot of work on that for the Toronto Star, and I wouldn't even want to attempt to do something like that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So there's your book, 22 Murders, and that looks like you can get that on Amazon. So
you can get it anywhere.
Excellent.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. And you, Adam?
Well, you can get mine on Apple Books. It's originally published through an e-publisher called Smashwords, where you can go directly. But Apple Books, Kobo, Scribd, all those places, you can find the ebook there. And you talk about the Sherman murders. Like I have to look at that.
Whoops. Yeah, I'd love it if you did. I mean, it's such a very, very interesting and just another very strange happening in Canada, and it's worthy of investigation. And I do believe someone's written a book. I don't know if that's the same guy that reports on it in the Star, but
oh, sorry. All right. So sorry. I don't know why the connection's fading in and out there, but I was doing coverage of the Mass Casualty Commission in these YouTube videos I was doing on a daily basis, but now I'm doing a weekly YouTube summary of Canadian law, what's going on. I do 5 or 6 stories, and people can just look me up on YouTube. But maybe I'll cover the Sherman situation, because I remember reading about it. It was very interesting story.
Very, very interesting. I mean, they were tied in with Trudeau, which is interesting, as major donors to the Liberal Party. And it was found out that there was going to be an investigation of some of the donations they'd made, to the tune that somebody is reporting that had it been found out, it would have put the Liberal government in a very, very difficult position, perhaps even affecting the Trudeau prime ministership, because it would have been bad. But because they were murdered, and then they were murdered in a very heinous and bizarre way, left in sort of a, in an odd position, they were sort of statued. And that was weird. Also, they were the makers of hydroxychloroquine, which has become a very big drug. I've actually been on hydroxychloroquine. It's one of the reasons I followed this so closely. They were manufacturers of hydroxychloroquine at Apotex, the organization, or the company that they ran, and so hydroxychloroquine became a big deal. So I don't know. Something's very weird that they were murdered. Then it was declared a suicide, and the family went berserk and said there's no way that they committed suicide. And then somebody would have had to put them in these odd positions. I mean, nothing made sense. But the police, again, very quickly came to conclusions that were completely false. And that's why it's become such an intrigue.
You look no worse for wear for having taken the medication or the drug.
No, I'm doing pretty good. It saved my life. I was told it.
Police investigate. They come to the first conclusion, and they stick with it almost no matter what. I've seen that many times.
Right. Is it an embarrassment? It's kind of like they don't want to ruin their reputation by going back or changing something.
Yeah, exactly. When most people, if they're, they see somebody that is confronted with new, more compelling information and they change their mind, they would respect that. But, they don't want to be seen that way.
Yeah, very interesting. I think it's how men are very They don't like to.
Laura-Lynn, excuse
Yeah.
me. The people in charge, right across the board
Right.
in Nova Scotia were female commanders.
Right.
Lee Bergerman, Janice Gray, Dustine Rodier. They had more than their fair share right to the top of the RCMP.
You're so right. You're so very right. And I truly believe that all injustice should be looked into. And this continues to just be such an interesting drama as it unfolds. It kind of feels like there will always be yet one more saga, one more piece that might be, keep coming forward. And we just haven't heard the end of it. So, well, I hope to do this again. And I thank you, gentlemen, for coming on together and for giving us such a very exclusive time with the both of you. And we welcome this to happen again. And good luck in the sales of your books and in all that you do for Canada. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having us on, and rest in peace to Leon Jodrey.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Absolutely fascinating. Very sad. People are important and how they feel. It's important to honor people. We don't have a culture of honor actually right now, and we need that. Those are two great guys looking it up, putting their reputations on the line to kind of look into something that's a little bit controversial here in Canada. Thank you all for being with me today. I sure do appreciate it. Thank you for standing with us as we go across the country. I appreciate your support, your kindness in all of this. I do want to say that something very interesting happened. So after we had Jeremy Mackenzie's girlfriend on the other night, within 2 hours, Jeremy was out of, where they put you in, what's that called, JT? Solitary confinement. Yeah. I was thinking of privacy something, but it's very bad as solitary confinement. And we did a show on it, and so did Viva Frey. And it was highlighted by a gentleman in Canada that said we need to, could all the independent producers start speaking about this? And wouldn't you know, Jeremy was taken out of solitary confinement within a couple of hours. And I think that's very good. And I thank them for doing that. Let's stop torturing people, and let's stop any use of political prisoners in this country. It's not right. It's not okay. One of the things that we're going to be discussing in this next week or so is going to be gold and silver. And we want you to know that there is a company that you can contact that we feel, we had so many people saying, who do you trust? Well, we personally trust Sun City Silver and Gold, and that is with Steve. And we want you to email him at sovereignize@protonmail.com. Steve Morrell is a gentleman that has helped us. He's been on the show. He's been in this business for a couple of decades. He understands what's happening. He says that silver is very low right now. And I personally feel in the air that there's problems with the money, and it doesn't take a rocket science. You all know that as well. So if you're looking to purchase gold or silver, that's who we recommend speaking with. But think about all the options that you have, and be safe and be careful at this time. We're enjoying, Mark Friesen and I, going out on these events that we're on. We're going to Barrie in Ontario. That will be our very next event. And then we'll have several of them after that. If you can go to my website, JT, if we can get those up on the website somehow, all of the many different places we'll be going to, because we're going all through Ontario. So the lower part of Ontario, and then over to New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. So the only place that we're not going to is Newfoundland. And I'm kind of sad about that. We're thinking about if there's any possible way to do that. I want to leave you with a scripture today. We certainly are completely befuddled by the evil that is taking place. Last night at my event, I actually read a verse in the Bible that I believe talks about the globalists. Did you know the Bible talks about the globalists, evil ones? I guess it would be about anyone who does evil and does not come to justice. You know, God sees it all, right? In the very top layers of a country, all the way down to our personal lives. God sees everything that we do, and he is the God of justice, keeping tabs and watching. And you know it's out of love, because he's such a loving and great God that he wants to reward us when we are righteous. And when we do what's right, when we walk in obedience, do you know that God will never leave you or forsake you, even if you do wrong? The Bible says that God is faithful even when we are not faithful. That means to me that he knows that we can be unfaithful. So some of us in our lives, we've been deceptive. Paul talked about, some of the groups, the new Christians that he was speaking to. And he said, some of you were like this. You were adulterers, you were murderers, you were thieves, but God has forgiven you, so it's a new day. As soon as we ask the Lord for forgiveness, we're on the right side. But this is what the Bible has to say about those who walk in deception and lies. It says, not a word from their mouth can be trusted. Their heart is filled with malice. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they tell lies. Gotta move back because my eyes. All right. Declare them guilty, O God. Let their intrigues be their downfall. Banish them for their many sins, for they have rebelled against you. But let all who take refuge in you be glad, and let them ever sing for joy. Spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may rejoice in you. Surely the Lord blesses the righteous. You surround them with your favor as with a shield. I believe lately that I've been surrounded with a shield. I've been blessed. I felt the favor of God, even though we're dealing with such treacherous things. I pray that you will understand that when you are walking in obedience to God, and when you're walking as one who wants to be righteous before him, and you're walking in the forgiveness of God, that he will surround you as a shield. Your shield and buckler, your strength, your source of power, even when this world can be a very, very dark place. God loves you. And even as we face these trying times in Canada, and we've got all kinds of things going on, we've got sudden adult death syndrome, we've got the death counts up, and nobody knows why people are passing away in Alberta. God is on the throne. God knows exactly what's going on. And for those who take bribes and those who succumb to the God of this world, there will be judgment. But for the righteous, for those who walk in obedience, his favor shall be your shield. Amen. I've loved being here with you. Thank you for being here with me. God bless. You know, it's not easy to deliver the truth of what our sick world is doing, but for some of us, we feel that we have no choice. Because if we are silent about these abominable things, then we are letting evil go unchecked, and we cannot do that. For those of you wonderful people who are writing me and are sharing your encouragement, I am deeply grateful. Thank you for all the letters that you've been sending. Thank you for the donations and the support. I found out that in order to speak the truth, you have to become very, very strong. If you would go to my website at www.laura-lynn.tv, you'll find all of the ways that you can contact me. Remember, my friends, all is well. All is well. Thanks for joining me.